a hardwood chair, and a bottle of rye. That was what Silas Drummond's debt bought. That and a girl. Wren Calloway had memorized the exact sound a chair makes when a man picks it up before he swings it. She had learned, over 2 years of living in Silas's back room, that there was a half-second pause between the scrape of the legs and the whistle of the air. Half a second was enough to turn your shoulder into the blow instead of your face. Half a second was the difference between a bruise and a broken jaw. She was thinking about that half second on the morning of the auction. The word auction was too clean for what it was. Silas had a debt to a man named Roy Buckner, and Silas had nothing left to pay it with, except the girl he'd been running as a cook and cleaner out of his roadhouse on the edge of Lac-Saint-Jean territory, since her father had handed her over for a bottle of whiskey and $60. Roy Buckner wasn't interested in the roadhouse. The roadhouse was rotting from the floorboards up. But a girl who could cook, clean, and keep her mouth shut. Roy Buckner had uses for that kind of arrangement. Wren stood in the cold light of the back doorway and listened to them negotiate. The October wind off the lake was a mean, personal thing. It found the gaps in the doorframe, pressed through the worn flannel of her shirt, settled into the hollows of her collarbones like it had always lived there. She was 22 years old. She weighed, she estimated, not much more than a sack of flour. She had not owned a coat that fit her since she was 16. She could have run. The thought crossed her mind with the same dull regularity it always did. She noted it. She filed it away. Running from Silas had consequences she had already catalogued in the bruising on her left side. The negotiation settled at $90. Roy Buckner's large, soft hand closed around her wrist, and Wren let it because resistance was math, and the math had never once worked in her favor. Then a different voice cut across the room. Let her go. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a timber beam settling, deep, unhurried, stating a fact rather than making a request. Wren turned her head. The man standing in the doorway of the roadhouse was not the kind of man who appeared in doorways without being noticed. He was large in the way that geography is large, without apology and without performance. His coat was dark canvas, work-worn, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold air and something faintly metallic. His face was all hard angles under 2 or 3 days of dark beard going silver at the jaw, and his eyes, when they moved from Roy Buckner to Silas to the hand around Wren's wrist, were the particular shade of gray-green you see in the St. Lawrence in November, just before freeze-up. This is a private transaction, Roy said. His voice had the oiled warmth of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The man in the doorway walked into the room. He moved like he'd been walking through cramped spaces his whole life and had learned not to knock things over. He stopped 2 feet from Roy Buckner. I said, let her go. Roy laughed. He looked around the room for backup. Silas was studying the floorboards. The 2 men at the bar were suddenly deeply interested in their glasses. You buying? Roy asked. A pause, the kind of pause that could go several directions. Then the man reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a fold of bills. He set them on the bar without counting them and without looking at Roy. That's $200, he said. Take it and leave. The silence in the roadhouse had a texture to it like fresh snow, soft on the surface, with something hard just underneath. Roy Buckner looked at the money. He looked at the man's hands scarred across the knuckles, resting loose at his sides. He did some private calculation. He let go of Wren's wrist. He took the money. The man in the canvas coat looked at Wren for the first time. Can you walk? She almost said, that's a strange question. She was standing upright, wasn't she? But she understood what he was actually asking, and the fact that he was asking it, instead of just grabbing her arm and hauling her out, made something very strange happen in the center of her chest. A feeling she had no name for, because she had stopped cataloging feelings that weren't useful for survival. Yes, she said. Then walk. He held the door. She walked through it. His truck was a faded green half-ton, easily 15 years old, with a crack running the length of the windshield, and a back seat occupied entirely by 2 large dogs and a canvas duffel bag. The dogs were mixed breed, gray-muzzled, and regarded Wren with polite indifference as she climbed into the passenger seat. The man got in. He started the engine. He did not speak. The lake road pulled them north into the long shadows of the spruce. After several minutes, Wren said, Where are you taking me, my place? He kept his eyes on the road. It's about 40 minutes, and then what? And then you can decide what you want to do next. He paused. There's a shelter in Alma. I can drive you there tonight if you'd rather. Wren looked at his profile. Tashtruv. He was not watching her with the sideways hunger she had learned to identify in the first 2 seconds of meeting a man. He was watching the road with the focused patience of someone who had driven this particular stretch of gravel in all seasons and knew exactly where the frost heaves were. What's your name? She asked. Everard. He said it like it was a word he didn't use often. Everard Foss, Wren, she said. He nodded once. Like her name was information he was filing away. They drove the rest of the 40 minutes without speaking. His place was not what she had expected, though she had not let herself form expectations. It sat back from the lake at the end of a 2-track road that wound through a stand of old-growth birch, their white trunks luminous in the early dark. The house was log and timber, low and solid, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. Firewood was stacked in neat cords along the south wall, floor to ceiling. Smoke was already rising from the chimney, some kind of slow-burn insert, she guessed, set on a timer or banked from morning. He had not been expecting company. The house showed that, but not in the way she feared. It showed it in the single plate on the drying rack, the one mug on the table, the book splayed face down on the arm of the reading chair, the utter unperformed solitude of a man who lived inside his own company and had made his peace with it. Everard set water to boil. He pulled 2 mugs from the shelf. He put bread and cold roast beef on a cutting board and set it in the center of the table without ceremony. Eat, he said. Wren sat down. She looked at the food. She had been calculating the weight of every meal for 2 years. What she was permitted, what she would be punished for taking, and for a strange, disorienting moment, she could not simply reach out and eat without calculating first. Everard had already turned his back to her, tending the stove with the complete disinterest of a man who had not laid a trap and was not monitoring whether she'd stepped into it. She ate. He made tea. He set a cup in front of her without asking how she took it. She noticed he had added powdered milk and no sugar, which happened to be exactly how she took it, though she had said nothing. Later, she would wonder if he had just guessed. Later, she would understand that he was the kind of man who paid attention without making a performance of it, which was the rarest kind of man she had ever encountered. The fire crackled. The dogs settled on the floor. Outside, the October wind moved through the birches, a sound like water or like breath. Wren put down her cup. She looked at the table. She said very quietly, "Do you want me to sleep in here, or is there a room?" Everard turned from the stove. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. There was something in it that looked like, not pity exactly. Pity was soft and slightly contemptuous. This was more like recognition, like he had seen something he had been expecting without wanting to find it. "There's a room," he said. "Second door on the left. There's a lock on it. Use it if you want." Wren nodded. She pushed her chair back and stood. "That's not what I meant," she said. She heard her own voice as if from outside herself, flat and businesslike and very tired. "I mean, do you want me to sleep in here?" A pause. "I want to know ahead of time how it works." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Everard set his mug down on the counter. He turned to face her fully. His gray-green eyes were very steady. "No," he said. His voice was not soft exactly. It was the opposite of soft. It was hard in the way a true thing is hard, with no give in it. "That's not what any of this is." Wren watched his face for the lie. She was very good at finding lies. She had learned to read the micro-expressions that flickered before a man's face, settled into whatever version of itself it wanted to present. The slight tightening at the corners of the eyes, the way the mouth went just barely too still. She found nothing. "I paid Buckner to get you out of there," Everard said. "That's the whole of it. You don't owe me anything. You're not property." He picked his mug back up. His hands were steady. Second door on the left. Wren stood in the middle of his kitchen for a moment that stretched past its natural length. Then she walked to the second door on the left, went inside, and sat on the edge of a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and clean laundry. She heard him moving in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur he made to the dogs, the click of the lamp. She did not lock the door. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the birches, waiting for the night to become what every other night had eventually become. It didn't. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe. She found him outside in the pale early light, splitting wood in a clearing at the side of the house. He had his coat off despite the cold, working in a flannel shirt, his breath coming in white plumes with each swing. He worked with a rhythm that was almost meditative, the axe falling in steady, even arcs, the split wood jumping apart and landing in neat halves. He did not look up when she came out onto the porch. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, between swings. Wren went in and poured herself a cup. She stood at the window and watched him work. She was thinking about the drive, and the roadhouse, and Roy Buckner's soft hands, and the weight of the money Everard had laid on the bar without drama, without looking at her like it purchased something. She was also thinking about the door she had not locked. Over the days that followed, a kind of routine established itself, carefully and without discussion, the way routines do in shared spaces when the people sharing them are not looking directly at each other. Wren cooked because cooking was the thing she knew how to do, and because she needed something to do with her hands, while she was still figuring out the shape of this new arrangement. She made soup from the smoked bones she found in the cold room. She baked bread from the flour in the tin by the stove, a heavy, dense loaf that she knew was better than it looked. She set the table without being asked. Everard accepted all of it without comment or apparent surprise, eating with the focused appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for a long time and was not too proud to enjoy the alternative. He washed the dishes. He stoked the fire in the evenings. He read. He fixed things. The creak in the kitchen floorboard that Wren had been noting disappeared one afternoon while she was at the lake. And when she came back, there were fresh wood shavings on the floor, and Everard was putting his tools away. He said almost nothing about himself. What she learned, she gathered in pieces. He had grown up in the Laurentians, the younger of two brothers. The brother was gone, she didn't know how, and she did not ask. He had been a commercial carpenter before he came up here 7 years ago, and before that she could not tell. He kept beehives on the south slope that were empty now until spring. He drove into Alma once a week for supplies, and sometimes didn't come back until evening, though she never asked where he'd been. He never asked her anything at all. She found this, at first, a relief. Then, slowly, something that troubled her. Not because she feared what he would do with her answers, but because she was beginning to understand that his not asking was its own form of respect. He was giving her back the right to her own story, to share it or not on her own time. She had not had that right in a very long time. 3 weeks into November, she told him some of it. Small pieces at first. She'd grown up in Chicoutimi. Her mother had died when she was 13. Her father had not been well equipped for grief or for parenthood even before that, and afterward he had been equipped for nothing at all. Everard listened. He was whittling something by the fire, his knife moving in small, precise strokes, his eyes on the wood. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "That must have been so hard." He did not offer her the kind of performed sympathy that requires something in return. He said, "Is there anyone you want me to help you contact when the roads clear in spring?" It was such an unexpected and practical form of care that Wren had to look away from him for a moment. "No," she said, "there's no one." He nodded. His knife kept moving. The first snow came in November, then more snow, and then more, and then the kind of snow that redraws the world entirely, that softens the hard edges of things and makes the familiar strange. The lake disappeared under it. The birches became white columns in a white field. The 2-track road vanished, and with it some tightly held part of Wren that had been watching for exits began very slowly to unclench. She was not healed. She understood that. She still tracked the position of every person who entered a room before she committed to sitting down. She still registered Everard's movements in her peripheral vision even while doing something else, the same way you register weather. Not with fear now, but with the body's ancient habit of monitoring for change. She startled at sudden sounds. She had 3 days in the 3rd week of November when she could not eat and could not speak and could not explain either, and Everard made soup and left it by her door and asked her nothing. He just left the soup. She ate it eventually. By December, she had stopped counting the days until spring. She was at the wood stove one morning, stirring oatmeal in the cast-iron pot, when she heard the dogs. Not their ordinary grumbling communication, something sharper, more urgent. The big one, a brindled male she had quietly named Spruce in her own head, was at the window with his hackles up, and the other was at the door, low and growling. Everard had already pulled his coat from the peg. "Stay inside," he said. He went out. Wren stood at the window. Through the frosted glass she could make out a truck on the two-track road, dark-colored. She didn't recognize it. Two figures got out. She saw the shapes of them, one wide and heavy in a sheepskin coat, one taller, carrying something long along his leg. Her body knew before her mind caught up. She was already reaching under the kitchen table where she had, with Everard's unspoken permission. He had shown her where it was, the week after she'd arrived, without explanation, and the absence of explanation had been its own instruction. Placed her hand around the grip of the short rifle he kept on the bracket under the worktop. She could hear the voices now, muffled through the door. A voice she recognized, Silas, the sheepskin coat. She had not known Silas would come. She had not known Roy Buckner had a brother either, but she could hear that in the taller man's voice now, the same oiled quality, the same entitled warmth that expected to be obeyed. She heard Everard's voice, low, unhurried. She heard the crack of a rifle. She was through the door before the echo died. The cold hit her bare arms like a slap. She had left her coat inside. She registered this and set it aside. Everard was on one knee in the snow, his right hand pressed to his left side, his face set in a particular way that she had learned meant he was managing pain with everything he had. The tall man, Buckner's brother, she was certain now, was raising the rifle for a second shot. Silas saw her first. He made a sound that was partly surprise and partly satisfaction, reaching toward her. He did not reach her. Wren raised the short rifle to her shoulder the way Everard had shown her, 3 weeks after she arrived, on an afternoon that had felt idle and purposeless, and now felt, with the clear vision of the present moment, like precisely what it had been. She settled her breathing. She fired once. The shot took Buckner's brother in the shoulder. He dropped the rifle. He went down. Silas stopped moving. The echo rolled out across the frozen lake and came back muffled and small. Wren lowered the rifle. Her hands were steady. Later they would shake, but not yet. Silas looked at her. He looked at the man in the snow. He looked at Everard, who had gotten back to his feet, his hand still pressed to his side, watching Silas with the expression of a man who has a great deal of time and patience, and no particular interest in how the next few seconds go. Silas got back in his truck. The sound of the engine faded down the two-track road. The world was very white and very quiet. Wren walked to Everard. He was still upright, which she was grateful for, but barely. She could see the dark stain spreading at his side too fast, too much. "Inside," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not." She put her shoulder under his arm. "Inside." He let her take his weight. Inside, she sat him on the kitchen chair, the same chair she had sat in that first night, eating roast beef and trying to understand the rules of a place that seemed incomprehensibly to have no rules at all. She pulled his coat open. She found the wound, a deep graze along the lower ribs, bleeding steadily but not arterial. She had seen wounds before. She had dressed some of them on herself. She worked without speaking. She boiled water. She tore a clean shirt from the drawer Everard pointed to and used it as she needed to. She poured whiskey on the cloth and on the wound, and Everard gripped the arm of the chair and said nothing. When it was done, she sat back on her heels. Everard was looking at her with the gray-green eyes that she had learned, over 2 months, to read a little better. There was something in them now she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not gratitude, exactly. Something quieter than gratitude, and more lasting. "You could have taken the truck," he said, "when you heard the first shot." Wren considered this. It was true. The keys were on the hook. The road to Alma was straight, once you were off the two-track. She had calculated this. She had calculated several things in the seconds between hearing the rifle and going through the door. "I know," she said. Everard waited. Outside, the wind moved through the birches. One of the dogs padded over and lay down at Everard's feet, pressing its warm weight against his boots. "The shelter in Alma," Wren said slowly. "Is that still the offer?" "It's always the offer," he said. "Whatever you want, when you're ready." She looked at him. This man who had laid money on a bar without looking at her like it purchased her, who had shown her where he kept the rifle without explaining why, who left soup outside a closed door and never asked to be thanked for it. "I'm not sure I know what I want," she said. "I haven't known that for a long time." "That's all right," Everard said. "There's no rush." The fire settled in the grate, a soft collapse of burning wood. "The snow's not going anywhere," Wren said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She got up and poured 2 cups of coffee because her hands needed something to do. She set one in front of him and kept the other. She sat down across from him at the table where she had sat 2 months ago, unable to simply reach out and take food because she had forgotten what it felt like to take something without owing a debt for it. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was hot and dark and bitter in the way she preferred, which Everard had known without asking. She looked out the window at the white birches, at the lake that was frozen now from shore to shore, at the snowfields stretching out under a sky the color of pewter. Spring was months away. She found she was not counting.